Well, I'm excited to be here this morning. I'm excited about the youth band leading this morning. Didn't they do a great job? Appreciate them. And I'm really excited about this afternoon and our reception for Doug and Betsy and Anna. And, this week I've spent some time as we've been getting ready, looking back at some pictures, and we're going to be displaying some things so we can kind of see some of the history of what's happened here. And, it just reminded me, of all of the consistency and the hard work of Doug and Betsy and Anna and so many others at our church who over the years have continued to pour in the lives of other people and the lives of young people. And we keep doing that. It's this cycle that we keep doing. And, and the kids stand up here today are because of so many other people who poured into other people who poured into other people. And I'm just thankful for what God has done. And I'm excited as we continue our series in the book of Deuteronomy. We'll be in Deuteronomy Chapter 26 here in a few minutes if you want to find that. But as we've done it, it's done just that for us. It's told us that we have to look back and remember what God has done in order to look forward to see what God's going to do next. And it's just an exciting thing for us to do. And when we feel that, when that gives us an emotional response, there's a word for that. That's called nostalgia. When we look back and something triggers a response from things in our past. And I'm getting to that age now where that happens to me more and more often. I was reading an article a few weeks ago, and it was talking about all these things that they saw people posting on the internet that was blowing their mind up because it was things like this. They said, do you know that when people are talking about 30 years ago, they're talking about 1992? That doesn't seem like that long ago to me. They said, did you realize that when we talk about the difference between 1980 and 2022, that's the same difference as 1980 and 1938? That's a long time ago. And then I saw this one. This one really got me. So this guy posted, he says, in the I'm getting old department, a kid saw this and said, oh, you 3D printed the save icon, because they'd only ever seen that on a screen. They'd never actually touched one of those. Everybody knows that is a disc, right? You put it in a computer, it's got information on it. Yeah. So nostalgia comes from this internal draw we all have to the familiar, and that's triggered by our senses. So it's things that we see. For me, I know that is triggered, by things like old phones. Does everybody remember the rotary phones? You had to go wait for it, and then you had to do it again, and then it had the rolled cord that was like 200 feet long at my house. So you go in a closet and hide and talk to your girlfriend. Yeah. I mean, those when I see those, that triggers memories. When I see old packaging, particularly old soda packaging, I don't know why. When I see old Pepsi and Coke bottles, that just reminds me of joyous times in my childhood at my grandma's house. It just triggers memories. Also things we smell. If we ever smell anything that reminds us of Mama's cooking, that takes us back to a moment, doesn't it? For me, I know smelling newsprint reminds me of all the years I spent reading comic books and collecting comic books. When I smell hay and diesel fuel, it makes me think of my dad and being on the farm, being out on the tractor together. So it triggers these memories. And neurologists have studied this. And this is really interesting. They actually said different things are going to trigger you, first of all, based on where you grew up. So if you grew up on the East Coast, it says most people will describe the smell of flowers as making them nostalgic for childhood. If you grew up in the South, it's more the smell of fresh air. If you grew up in the Midwest, which is a lot of us, it's the smell of farm animals, because we all know what that smells like. And if you grew up on the West Coast, they say most people from the West Coast, the smell of meat cooking and barbecuing takes you back to your childhood. We're also triggered differently based on when we were born. They found that people born from 1900 to 1930 tended to only have natural smells that made them nostalgic for childhood, things like trees, horses, pine. But if you're born after 1930, you're more likely to describe artificial smells like Play-Doh, Pez, Sweet Tarts, Vapo Rub, and jet fuel. That'll take you back to those moments in your life. But here's what happens for me. When I have a nostalgic moment, what happens to me is I begin thinking about what we call the good old days. Have you ever heard people use that for, I remember the good old days when we did this and we did that, and it takes us back to this moment. And we just have to be honest here for a minute and realize that a lot of times that was idealism, and it was never quite as good or even quite as bad as maybe we remembered things. Like our mind has kind of filled in some gaps and remembered that differently. But I think it's also good for us to realize some of that should lead us to remember the things that we valued in our lives and throughout history, the things that were valuable to us, and why those good old days have this appeal to us, why we're longing for a different time. In our culture today, man, I am in so many conversations with people who are just struggling with how difficult things are in the world today. And I hear a lot of people have that kind of, man, in the good old days, and I wish we could go back to these times kind of discussions. But what we got to realize is what we're really asking for is the things that we commonly held in those times. Those are things like close connections. We long to have those again. Things like tight-knit communities, things like common values. And church history kind of helps us with this. Church researcher Tom Rainer points out that in the last 200 years, 80%, 8 out of 10 churches that have been founded were founded in and for a particular community. So it was founded in a neighborhood or in a particular community. It was maybe even named after that community. The people who attended it worked in and lived in that community. But what's happened is for a lot of those churches, over time, the community changed. The neighborhood changed. Maybe transportation and economy forced people to either move or begin commuting somewhere else to work. The neighborhood itself changed. New people moved in. Old people moved out. Neighbors stopped knowing each other. New generations stopped coming to that church, and they either stopped altogether or started driving somewhere else to find a more relevant church for them. But here's an interesting thing. In the last couple of years, people during the pandemic found out that they were lonely, disconnected, and they needed neighbors' help. I had some people, even in our community, mention to me, they were like, I didn't know there were so many kids that lived on my street because I'd never seen them before. And then we spent that time where we had to be at home, and kids got sick of being at home with their family, and they went outside and played in the street, and they're like, there was kids everywhere. And we've also seen around the country and even in our community, people saying, you know what? I need to refine that community church. I need to reconnect with people in my community who can help me and can come alongside me, and so they don't feel so lonely and disconnected. See, nostalgia can kind of lead us maybe to think things a little bit maybe not correctly, but nostalgia can also lead us to remember our history and lead us to reform, to change, to go back to doing things the way God wants us to do them. You know, we've been looking at the book of Deuteronomy, and we've learned in it that its goal is to cause us to remember so we can move forward in the right ways. It's talked to us a lot already about our heart, and that this can't just be something that we do because it's a checklist, but it's something we've got to do from the inside. Famously, it tells us that we need to love God with all our heart, soul, and strength. And so as we look back all these thousands of years ago when this was written, I want us to realize it wasn't just for that generation. If you fast forward in the book of the Old Testament, books of the Old Testament, we get to the Kings period, a time where they kind of lost their way again, and King Josiah found the book of Deuteronomy, lost in the temple, got it out, read it before all the people, and they began returning to him. We find the prophets during the time of exile, after Nebuchadnezzar had come in and attacked and taken all of the Israelites out and destroyed their city, holding on to the words of Deuteronomy, reminding them that God was going to deliver them again. We see in the New Testament Paul and John and Peter and Jesus himself quoting Deuteronomy, reminding us that God is a gracious God and a jealous God. And even here, as we've been going through this for the last several weeks, we see that these ancient words talk about the very things we're dealing with today. And so I want us to remember that as we look at the reforms that I believe we're going to see in Deuteronomy chapter 26 today. So if you guys would turn there with me, Deuteronomy chapter 26, we'll start in verse 1. This is the very end of the second of 3 sermons that we see from Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. He had sat the nation of Israel down at the banks of getting ready to go into the promised land, and he gave them a series of talks, and this is the end of the second of 3 talks we'll look at in this book. And last week we dug through the majority of this speech as he talked about all of the rules and laws they were supposed to follow. He retold the 10 Commandments, he talked to them about the covenant, and then he told them about the principles they were supposed to follow in this promised land. And then he end caps this, like we do with any good sermon, with an altar call. He says, at the end of this, this is how you're supposed to respond to the things that God is doing and give your offerings and your sacrifices. And so he describes for us in this our worship. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 1 says this, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and you take possession of it and live in it, take some of the first of all the land's produce that you harvest from the land the Lord your God is giving you, and put it in a basket. Then go to the place where the Lord your God chooses to have his name dwell. When you come before the priest who is serving at that time, say to him, today I declare to the Lord your God that I have entered the land the Lord swore to his fathers to give us. And so what he's describing here is when they get into that promised land, he says the very first thing you're going to do, First thing, don't pass go, don't collect $200. First thing you're going to do is you're going to go and find the place God wants you to set up for his temple and for worship. And you're going to bring the first fruits of the produce of the land that you didn't even plant. You're just going to harvest it because they're already growing there in this promised land because it's flowing with milk and honey. You're going to go get these produce, and the first of it, you're going to come and you're going to offer it to God. It's a response. It's a worship. And I want us to understand that this concept of first fruits, we're a little removed from it. Because even if you're in agriculture, everything is converted at some point to currency and numbers and systems. I know for me, when I get paid once a month. And so I get the lump sum at one time. And the first thing I do is I write out my tithe check to give back to the church. And that's a principle that we learn in the Bible. And actually, right now on Sunday nights, we're going through a series on biblical financial principles. And it's not too late to jump in. We'll be starting that tonight at 6 o'clock if you want to join us in the Family Life Center. But it's one of those principles. We like we say right here, we give the first fruits. But for me, I already have all the fruits. I'm just choosing to give this part first. For them, they gave the first fruits as they got it as a trust that God was going to provide more. God, you gave this to me, I'm going to give it back to you, trusting that you're going to keep providing. It was this response to know that everything they had was not because of them, but because God was a provider. And so then Moses tells them how they're supposed to make this offering. Verse 4, then the priest will take the basket from you and place it before the altar of the Lord your God. You are to respond by saying in the presence of the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with a few people and resided there as an alien. There he became a great and powerful and populous nation. But the Egyptians mistreated and oppressed us and forced us to do hard labor. So we called out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord God heard our cry and saw our misery, hardship, and oppression. Then the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, with terrifying power and with signs and wonders. He led us to this place. He gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and I have now brought the first of the land's produce that you, Lord, have given me. And historians believe that this is actually what we call a liturgy, or an order of service that they used literally every time that they came and made an offering. So every time they came and made their offerings, they would stand up and together they would say these exact words as kind of a model for how we make this offering. But I want us to notice the plot that is described in these verses, because it retells the story of redemption, doesn't it? It tells us that in history, God's people have wandered from his path and wound up in foreign places. They went down to Egypt. They left the promised land. They left God's path. And when they got there, guess what? They were treated harshly. Things did not go well for them there. So what did they do? They cried out to the Lord. When they found themselves in the place that they didn't want to be and they didn't know how to get out of it, they said, God, we believe that you're in heaven. We believe you have power, and we need out of here. Even though we may have wandered here ourselves, please help us get back on path. And what does God always do? He brings us out with signs and wonders, and then he brings us to a place flowing with milk and honey. It's this cycle that we see over and over again. Whether we talk about the Garden of Eden in the fall, whether we talk about the flood, whether we talk about the Exodus, whether we talk about the exile, whether we talk about the cross or our own lives, this is what God keeps doing. We get off path, we find ourselves in a foreign place, we cry out, and God, in his grace, comes down, brings us out, and takes us back to the place that he has called us to. Which leads us to our next verse, verse 11. Actually, the end of 10 into 11. It says, you will then place the container before the Lord your God and bow down to him. You, the Levites, and the resident aliens among you will rejoice in all the good things the Lord your God has given you in your household. So when we realize what God has done for us and that pattern of redemption and how he saves us, our response should be worship, to come and say, God, thank you for what you've done. And I want us to notice a word right in the center of verse 11 is rejoice. See, every other culture, every other religion, from that time really until today, their worship is all about trying to appease and work their way to making sure God doesn't hate them. If I can do enough, if I say the right things, if I say the right words, if I stand up and sit down enough times, maybe God will not smite me and send me out of his presence. But that's not the way with God's people. Our worship is a response, a thanksgiving, a rejoicing because God has already offered us his grace and redemption. He already has sent that gift of salvation through Jesus, and we are simply responding to what he has given us. I want us to look back for a minute at some verses we read last week in chapter 12, where it describes a little bit more about this offering process, because it reminds us in chapter 12, verse 4, to not worship like everyone else is worshiping. Don't look around and see the way other people are doing it. Do it the way God describes, and this is what he says. Instead, turn to the place the Lord your God chooses from all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling and go there. You're to bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tenths and personal contributions, your vow of offerings and freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. And listen to this, verse 7. You will eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your household in everything you do because the Lord your God has blessed you. I want us to think about what's happening here. So let's just play this through. So you are coming to make an offering. You're bringing some produce and you're bringing some animals. And you get to the place where you're making the offering, where God has set up his temple, and there's an altar, and there's a fire, and there's a priest. You slaughter your animals. You cut off the fat and the meat portions. You give it to the priest. He puts it on the altar, and it over a fire, and then you sit down and have a meal. What does that sound like to you guys? That's a barbecue. That's a barbecue, right? You know, so last week we talked a little bit about this. So how many of you here like barbecue? Anybody like barbecue? All right. So let me find out what kind of barbecue you guys like. So last week we talked about pulled pork. Thank you, Jesus. So how many of you are pulled pork people? Like your go-to barbecue is pulled pork. That's a lot more than first service. I think there's 3 pulled pork people. So, all right. So how about this? How many of you are like ribs? Like if I'm getting barbecue, I'm getting ribs. All right, man, that's good. How about grilled, like barbecue chicken? Like if it's really good barbecue chicken, man, that's really good. But then this last one, this is my people. Where are you guys at? How about brisket? Yeah, man, there's nothing better than brisket barbecued in the right way. I love a good brisket. So in honor of that discussion, I've got a giveaway. So I've got some Blues Hog original barbecue sauce here, which Tyler Boggs, who's a really good barbecuer, by the way, he uses this brand. And so I'm going to give this away to somebody who can answer this trivia question. So if the priest is the guy who's preparing the food, so let's think about who the original guy was that did that. Who was the first guy to do that for the nation of Israel? What's his name? First hand up, gets barbecue sauce. Do I know? Aaron, Moses' brother, was the first priest, the first barbecue master. So are you a barbecue master, Lynn? No, but maybe that'll help you out. That's good. So this is the point, though. Listen to this. So when we have good barbecue, what do we want to do? We want to eat it, and then what do we want to do? We want to share it. We want to offer it like, hey, man, come check this out. I made some great barbecue. You should come over and try it. I'm really good. It's really good. So with that in mind, I want us to look back here at verse 11 and see what just happened. So it says, out of response of the redemption that God has offered you and all the good things he's done for you, you're to come to this place and offer your first fruits and make an offering and sit down and have a meal. You and the Levites and the resident alien who lives among you, and rejoice in these good things. You hear the sharing that happened right there? Because let's think about this. So the Levites, these were the part of the nation of Israel that were the priests, and they did not get a part of the land. They did not have a land inheritance. Every other part of the nation of Israel was going to have a land to raise their crops and their flocks on, but not the Levites. They didn't have any land. They didn't have any way to make for themselves. And so when you make an offering, you share with those guys who don't have that. And then the resident aliens, these are people, again, they didn't have an inheritance there, but they had chosen to be there. They were a part of what was going on. And so you share with those who don't have. Because this is a great truth we need to realize. As God gives to us, we're to give back. Our worship and offerings should focus on responding to God's gracious gifts, his forgiveness and redemption and salvation, eternal life and freedom. And that blessing should motivate us to be generous. Darrell Miller, who's a Christian author, and he works in a lot of relief ministry around the world, he says this: God's nature is compassion. He's looked down at each and every one of us, saw our situation, saw us crying out, and in compassion he reached out and pulled us up to him. But he says this: he acts compassionately, and he expects his people to do the same. Deuteronomy Chapter 26, verse 12 goes on to help us with this. It says, when you have finished paying all the tenths of your produce in the 3rd year, the year of the 10th, you are to give all of it to the Levites, resident aliens, fatherless children, and widows, so that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. So did you hear that? So every 3rd year, you don't just share, you give it all to these categories of people. So let's go again over these categories of people he talked about. So there's the Levites. those who have no land, no way to provide for themselves, resident aliens, those who have chosen to be a part of the nation even though they weren't born there, the fatherless children, what do we call that? Orphans, and the widows, those who have lost their spouse. And as we look through the Bible, don't we see those categories brought up again and again? Don't we see in the New Testament that these are the type of people that Jesus calls us to reach out and care for, those who are marginalized and vulnerable and don't know how to care for themselves? See, our worship is supposed to be set up to take care of that. We still have those categories of people, don't we? Deuteronomy 15 talks about the tension of all this. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 15 and verse 4, it says, there will be no poor among you in the promised land. There's enough resources for everyone to have what they need. No one should be poor. But then in verse 11, it says, for there will never cease to be poor people in the land. Is that a contradiction? That's not a contradiction. That's a tension. There should be enough, but we're always going to have these tensions of people not having enough. And there's a variety of reasons. You know, it could be personal choices. Again, we walk off the path. We veer and steer off on our own selfish courses, and sometimes that causes it. But also sometimes it's tragedy or catastrophe, circumstances. Sometimes it's systemic inequality and injustice. But no matter what caused it, it doesn't seem like here in Deuteronomy that God lets us off the hook. Back in verse 15, he talks about it this way. He says, if there's a poor person among you, one of your brothers within any of your city gates in the land the Lord your God has given you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your poor brother. Verse 10 says, give to him and don't have a stingy heart when you give, and because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you do. But then in verse 15, he really tells us why he wants us to do this. He says this, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I'm giving you this command today. So again, what is our worship supposed to be about? It's remembering the cycle of redemption, that I'm thankful that God has relieved me from my situation. And he says our response should be share that same grace and mercy with other people. God tells us to remember what he did for us in our poverty, and that should change how we help other people. You know, these are all really good ideas, right? This is a good concept, but when we get to this part, it's really this question of how do we do that? You know, often in our culture, you know, we may be faced with pictures of suffering children or stories of impoverished widows, and that makes us feel bad, doesn't it? Especially if we don't have want or need in our life. You know, I've got a roof over my head, I got plenty of food to eat, I can pay my bills. You know, when I do that and I see other people can't, it makes me feel bad. And a lot of times what we do at that point is that we get our checkbook out, we open it, and we try to give something to make ourselves feel less guilty. But that's not really what this is prescribing, is it? What this is prescribing is not charity, but solidarity. The end of this chapter, chapter 26, kind of gives us a picture of what God is calling his people to be. It says in verse 16, the Lord your God is commanding you this day to follow these statutes and ordinances. Follow them carefully with all your heart and all your soul. Today you have affirmed that the Lord is your God and that you will walk in his ways, keep his statutes, commands, and ordinances, and obey him. And today the Lord has affirmed that you are his own possession, as he has promised you that you're keeping all his commands. That he will elevate you to praise, fame, and glory above all nations he has made, and that you will be a holy people to the Lord your God as he promised. When we follow God, we become a people and a nation and a community that is known to bless others. And so that's our question today. How do we do that? You know, a few weeks ago, we shared with you our mission statement at Calvary Chapel. Our mission, what we do, what we're about every day, should be engaging people to live surrendered lives as constant disciples in kingdom service to Christ our Lord. And as we think about what that means, we talked about the fact that it should lead us to ask this question: how do I get involved in the needs of the people around me to spread the fame of what God has done in my life? How do I be on the lookout to be a blessing to others? Anthony Ashley Cooper, who's the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury. Now that's a great name, right? Just recognize that. Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, wrote in the 18th century that compassion should be to join with in passion. When I, as a follower of Christ, see someone in need, then I should figure out how to join with them passionately because of the things that God has done in my life. So here's a few ideas as we kind of wrap this up today on how maybe we could practically do that. The first thing we need to do is we've got to start showing respect and dignity to those who are vulnerable, what maybe the Bible is called the poor. We've talked through this about having empathy. And so if we have compassion, we have to have empathy. And empathy means that I notice you and I care about you. And so the best thing we can do is to show people dignity, because no matter what their situation is, they are a creation of God, and they image God himself, and we should show them dignity and respect. And so that means I should look at them and acknowledge them and maybe listen to them and try to understand where they're at. That's a really good thing for us to do, just to listen. People need us to be there to listen to them. And so that's a really great first step that we can do when we see people in need around us. Another thing we can do is to be quick to respond to the needs of the most vulnerable. We think about that list of people, those who can't provide for themselves, widows, orphans, those because of health or circumstances can't provide for themselves at this season of life. As we look around and see that, we can start asking ourselves, how could I go help with some of the physical needs that person has? How could I come alongside them through the things that they can't handle on their own and be a part of the solution? And then we also have to balance a tender heart and a clear head. One of the things that we are really passionate about is finding other people or organizations who are meeting needs in a real way, not just putting a Band-Aid on things, but getting to the symptom issues and trying to fix it. I really appreciate our partnership with Ozark Food Harvest that allows us to do the food distribution we do, which will be coming up this Tuesday. They're an organization who, through all over this part of the country, are trying to provide food and training and resources to help people get out of the cycles of poverty that they're in. I'm glad that we can partner with people like that. I'm really thankful for the local OCAC Neighborhood Center who's partnered with us, so we have a central place that people can go if they've got needs for utilities, rent, food, and ask those questions there, and then they find the resources, whether it be churches or other organizations, to help meet that need. So we're not a whole bunch of us trying to put a Band-Aid on the same problem, but we're trying to get to the basis of fixing those things. Thankful that globally we're able to partner with people like World Vision. Next week we're going to talk to you about the 6K for water and how we partner with them to make a difference over in other countries where they don't have access to clean water. Thankful for our partnership with Samaritan's Purse that we do the Operation Christmas Child. We take the gospel to kids in places we will never be able to go. I'm thankful that we get to do that. We need to look for ways to partner with people who are doing a good work. And then lastly, when possible, provide employment. Deuteronomy Chapter 24 shows this really cool picture of what the landowners were supposed to do. If you're a landowner, they prescribe that you don't harvest your crops to the very edge of your fields, but you leave the edges so that those who don't have land can come in and harvest those crops for their families. And I love that because, those people could have harvested all the crops and then made a decision to give some of that to those people, but that gave those people dignity to come and help out and be a part. And we need to look for ways to do that. One of the biggest problems and barriers for people who are in poverty is disaffiliation. They aren't networked with people who can help them get out of their situation. We need to ask ourselves, are there ways that we can be a part of that solution? And as we think about all that, you may not be able to do everything or help everybody, but you can do something. I read a story about a lady named Beatrice who lives in a slum in Nairobi, and she thankfully had enough to meet her needs, and she found out about an organization that was coming into their area that was going to try to help with other people who couldn't meet their needs, and so she went to their meetings and got trained actually on how to go out and help people make the next best steps to get out of the situation they're in. So Beatrice was super excited, and she started going down her street, just knocking on doors, talking to her neighbors, seeing if there's ways she could help, and invite them to some of these trainings. And the first house she went into, she was just in the house talking to these people, and she noticed that the children in that house were sleeping on a dirt floor. Now, in their country, most people sleep on a padded mat, and the adults had mats, but the kids didn't have mats. And so Beatrice said, you know what? I'm going to be right back. And she went home, and she cut her mat in two and took that mat back, that half a mat back, and said, I'm going to give this to your kids. And that was just one step. In one small way, that she took something she had and she decided to share it, to be a part of showing compassion and grace to someone else because God had shown compassion and grace to her. We may not be able to fix all the problems, and we may not have all the answers, but you know what we can do? We can, first of all, ask God to be involved in our lives and accept that cycle of redemption for ourselves. But then we can look around and say, how can I offer that cycle to others? In closing, I want to tell you another really great named person from the 18th century. the German Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Now, is that a great name or what? Who also lived in the 18th century. Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, when he was 19, he toured Europe. And just, he was an aristocrat, and he was from a wealthy family, and he toured Europe. And his tour took him to Dusseldorf. And in Dusseldorf, there was an art exhibit set up. And he went to this art exhibit and was looking through the paintings. And he stopped at this particular painting by a painter named Domenico Feti. And in English, this is known as Behold the Man. And so we've got a picture up here. And it's a picture of Jesus, pre-crucifixion, really, but getting ready to go to the cross. And at the bottom, there's some Latin, and in case you don't know Latin very well, we'll translate that for you. It says this, I have done this for you, what will you do for me? And he said he couldn't get over that. And he went home and he couldn't get over that. And he thought about that. Jesus went to these lengths for me, what am I doing for him? And so in 1727, he opened his estate to the poor and displaced as a place of refuge. Some of those who came in were Christians, others became Christians while they were there. And they started a prayer movement that turned into a 24/7 prayer movement that lasted for 100 years. That prayer movement birthed the Moravians, which they were a missionary group that inspired William Carey to start what we call and know as modern missions of churches sending people to other countries to take the gospel. All that because one guy saw what he had, saw what Jesus had done for him, and decided to share it. What would happen if we shared offerings in that way? What could God do? What could God begin if we begin looking around us and saying, how do I get involved? Jesus, you've done this for me. What can I do for you? Would you guys stand with me?